Death's Door is almost a masterpiece. For over a year, I have been bombarded with recommendations from people to go play Death's Door. Championed as one of the indie darlings of 2021, the botched adventure of our little bird reaper has made waves by borrowing elements from classic Legend of Zelda titles and Dark Souls, much like half of all the other critically acclaimed indies of the last decade. Setting aside my cynical streak, I embraced the pseudo-isometric dungeon crawler with high expectations. I've been meaning to find something to distract me and blow off some steam from the real-world stressors I've had going on for the last 2 months. Yearning for an adventure I'd easily assimilate into proved feasible, as the narrative and world building was simple enough to dive into and quirky enough to maintain my interest. Death's Door is delightfully grim. It's not too steeped in its own gothic demeanor, always remembering to shoot you a smile or make you laugh from time to time. And it never takes itself too seriously, sort of like one of those Tim Burton films with the talking pumpkin or the big-ass peach or whatever. However, there are still these moments where the laughing track dies down, reeling you back into the cold, hard truth when it needs to remind you that this is ultimately a game about death and how characters react to their ephemerality. The first half of Death's Door is nothing short of incredible. Our hero, affectionately dubbed the Reaper, works in a rundown office space called the Reaping Commission that seems to have been torn asunder by a series of dimensional rifts. Work here is sparse, with some of the crows later talking about a soul shortage, preventing the Reapers from doing their job collecting the expired spirits. Miraculously, amid this umbral deficiency, a request is specifically assigned to you, chartering the Reaper to hunt down a giant soul that simply refuses to die. No time is wasted, as the door to the predetermined location is transmuted to your position, easily allowing our feathered friend to be transported to his target. Though, before his mission begins, the Reaper is reminded that the door will remain open until he returns with his designated soul, and while the door remains open, he will age and potentially die, building on the earnestness and severity of the task at hand. The Grove of Spirits exists as a very short and simple tutorial stage, showing you some of the rudimentary dungeon crawling options available to the player, like rolling around or how to use your magic items before throwing yourself into the fire with the tutorial's capstone monster. As seen in other Souls-light games, encounters with these behemoths require a recognition of telegraphed attacks, exploiting weaknesses, and patience. The Reaper has access to a flurry of blows with his standard attack action, along with a charge attack that deals extra damage, but I never really used it through my playthrough. The dodge mechanic exists as a means to increase speed and distance while also giving yourself a few extra invincibility frames to mitigate damage itself. Your magic items serve as a ranged option for combat, giving you access to abilities like arrows, fire magic, and more. These spells can be used a limited number of times, as shown by the magic meter beneath your health bar. While this resource is minimal, anytime that you deal melee damage to an enemy or interactable asset, your meter recovers at least by 1 node. Combat is a straightforward dance of bobbing and weaving around enemy attacks and either hitting them with your sword or your projectiles. Major enemies aren't that challenging, just requiring a bit of time to learn their habits and when you can whiff punish their attacks, and all of this is easily experienced in the opening sequence. Following the success in accomplishing your first mission in what seems like ages, a portal tears through reality and you're snuck up on and knocked out by a massive bird-like creature before he takes your giant soul and heads off to God knows where. Upon coming to your senses, you find this makeshift gateway. With your objective now lost and no other way to reclaim your prize, the Reaper steps into the unknown, as it is the only way to prevent his own untimely death. You're dropped off in this heavily cluttered overworld dubbed the Lost Cemetery. Jagged stalagmites are accompanied by unmarked graves and mysterious carvings amidst a land formed by natural mountainside and Gothic architecture. As the Reaper begins their ascent to the north, you catch a hearty glimpse of your would-be assailant, a large, grizzled gray crow. You begin to make chase, encountering new dungeon crawling mechanics that harken to the 2D Zelda era. Switches that open gates, lock doors with errant keys, eliminating swarms of minor enemies to advance, the whole shebang. By the time that the Reaper makes it to the northern cliffside, it's far too late. The Elder Avian relinquishes your hard-earned giant soul to a massive, imposing cathedral door. As the spirit is enveloped by the door's eminence, a guttural pulse reverberates through you as the floating entryway begins to fracture. Our towering larcenist hovers over you, extending an apology. You see, this old gray crow, simply known as the Old Gray Crow, was once a young reaper as well. While attempting to complete his task, his assigned soul escapes him, and he has spent the last few centuries trying to track it down, ultimately bringing him here, to Death's Door. Something I didn't really touch on was the importance of these doors. To keep it brief, the Reaping Commission exists within the Hall of Doors, which opens gateways to far-off lands for the Reapers to hunt in. The Reaper collects the souls are converted into energy, the energy powers the doors, the cycle repeats. What sets Death's Door apart from the other doors is that it seemingly exists outside of the network of the Hall of Doors. What hides behind it is a mystery. It stands perpetually locked without any rudimentary method to break it open. What the Elder Crow surmises is that he needs the strength of 3 more giant souls to break down Death's Door and retrieve both his own lost soul as well as yours. This is where the game really begins to open up. While its trajectory is linear in nature, you have a clear understanding of the tasks presented to you, as well as the limited freedom to explore the overworld so long as your present toolkit permits you to do so. And as you unlock more abilities, new avenues of exploration are made available to you, always incentivizing you to return to previous maps to pick up some of the trinkets and lost items you may have missed along the way. Now, this is where the Reaper crosses the threshold by committing to this task. I don't want to get too deep into the dynamics of this adventure and the relationships between our feathered friend and his antagonists, but I do want to showcase the expectations that developer Acid Nerve built in the first half of Death's Door so I can later highlight where their efforts begin to falter. As you make your journey in search of the first giant soul, the unrefined mountainside slowly morphs into a Victorian-style domain with ornate stone carvings and detailed statues that curiously fashions pottery for heads, marking the moment that you've entered the estate of the Urn Witch. In my opinion, this area is by far the most visually pleasing in the game, both with gorgeous stage design and some of the most interesting creatures and interactable NPCs, specifically Pothead. His overjoyous demeanor, his general agreeableness, the contagious air of positivity just give off the strong familiar energy from someone like Solaire of Astoria. He periodically shows up at different points of the Urn Witch's estate, slowly piecemealing you information about the denizens of the manor, of how he was once made of flesh and bone, and how the ceramic enchantress had somehow aged well beyond her years. Each encounter strikes you with a hit of jolly dopamine, because it feels like you're really traversing the halls of this palace together, even though you're the one who's doing all of the heavy lifting. That feel-good sensation is then ripped from your gut when you finally come face to face with the Urn Witch herself, appearing right after you free your first Reaper soul. The stringed instruments in the background music begin building up this suspenseful tension as this old woman that looks like a cross between Yubaba from Spirited Away and one of those cannibalistic Matryoshka dolls just stares through you with this cold, dead glare. Her greetings are at first based in curiosity, but subsequent encounters find our Reaper friend testing her limited patience, and it reaches a crescendo when she kidnaps our newfound faithful companion, Pothead. There really isn't a lot of lore surrounding the locations of Death's Door as, say, The Legend of Zelda, where there tends to be a significant level of preamble when preparing to tackle an unknown environment. What Death's Door does instead is provide you that motivation as you survey each stage by creating these fantastic creatures that sort of hold your hand along the way. They do the same thing with the Frog King of the Mushroom Dungeon, who's this arrogant and bombastic cunt that just makes you want to beat their face in. There's not a lot to Death's Door. It's a scaled down version of any portable 2D Zelda title. And up until this point right here, Acid Nerve has been knocking it out of the park. But to reference Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces for a moment, unbeknownst to the player, once we cross this threshold right here and begin to approach the innermost cave, that dynamic quickly evaporates and we're left with an ally that offers little to keep us entertained or motivated to press on through Castle Lockstone and the old watchtowers, outside of simple obligation to the mission. The antagonizing capstone enemies are now replaced by the apparitions of Lords of Doors past, slowly feeding you this cryptic information of how the Hall of Doors came to function, and ends with a boss that has next to nothing to do with the overarching story at all, with just a light reference from a drunk NPC in the previous town. It ended up feeling incredibly rushed, like Acid Nerve wasn't exactly sure how they wanted to tackle the third act. And it happens with a lot of games that to this day are still considered classics. However, in this case, this is essentially the end of Death's Door, because you know that once you've accomplished what you needed to do here, you'll deliver the giant souls to the Old Gray Crow who's waiting for you back at the point of origin. You don't know exactly how it's going to go down. The old head might try to double cross you again, take the souls for himself like he did before, and cut loose ends with you. But once you do make the trek back to the cliffside of the Lost Cemetery, coming face to face with your remorseful aggressor, you see the relief from the Elder Crow. And there's this newfound resolve experience between you and your new ally as you commit to breaking down Death's Door and reclaiming your lost prizes, to which you find nothing. Literally nothing. And look, I hate spoiling shit on people, so if you're planning on playing Death's Door for yourself, or if you haven't finished it yet, this would be the time to skip ahead to a later timestamp or close the video because I'm going to start talking about the ending. When you break down Death's Door, you find this void of nothingness, save the entity called Death. Puzzled by the lack of spiritual energy, the old Grey Crow questions Death where all the souls are and where his assigned soul is specifically. Death responds in explaining that any non-corporeal soul that enters the realm is absorbed by the Aether, since soul energy must be generated to create new life. The souls that both the Grey Crow and our Reaper have been searching for has long since traveled beyond the Veil. We also get some background information of how the Reaper Commission came to be by this agreement between Death and the First Lord of Doors. The responsibilities of Death would be outsourced to the Lord of Doors and their conglomerate in return for immortality, which would be impossible, as souls have an expiration date, and whenever a soul sticks around for too long, they will turn into a demon. There's a lot of aha moments going on here, with this lore dump harkening back to something that was said by the Urn Witch way back in the Ceramic Manor about a deal between her and your employer. But it's relatively fleeting and never really revisited until this point here. And the old man here is having none of it. Old dude spent the last few centuries trying to get back his soul so he can get on with his life, only to realize that all this time has been wasted. This sends the old Grey Crow into a fit of rage, transforming him into a demon, and you're forced to put the old man down. It's supposed to be this somber and bittersweet moment. I feel like I'm supposed to feel bad for him because the game is telling me I'm supposed to, but I'm not quite there yet. The connection between the player and the Grey Crow hasn't been reinforced well enough because I still think of him as this asshole who stole my target, and now I can't get it back. For a moment, in your mind, just substitute the Elder Crow with a character like Pothead. Think about a character that you may have spent some significant amount of time with throughout your journey and just swap them. You would feel some sense of urgency in rescuing them or saving them from this sort of calamity, and you would feel bad about being forced to essentially kill them at their lowest moment. What's missing here from this interaction is true empathy for the old Grey Crow. Empathy that could have been totally fostered had there been more time spent between he and the Reaper. Instead, we're treated to some lore dump into boss fight into lore dump into boss fight end credits type thing. The game wraps up with you meeting the Free Crow Enclave or whatever to go off about some prophecy, and you ultimately fight the current Lord of Doors that you only very briefly encountered after the Urn Witch fight. I mean, when you first come face to face with the current Lord of Doors, it's sort of this awkward encounter or conversation with someone who wants nothing to do with you. And throughout the remainder of the game, I was always expecting that if this character was so important to the story, they would have done more to reintroduce them to the player and shed some light on their level of importance. One could argue that the third act is supposed to serve that purpose, but it never really brings the importance of the current Lord of Doors home. And I'm questioning, why should I give a shit? Had the third act done more to highlight the legacy of the current Lord of Doors, instead of solely focusing on the historical context of Door Monarchs prior, I as the player would have been far more enthusiastic about sticking it to the man in the end. Instead, it feels a bit more like a bait and switch with who the actual villain is. We see this sort of thing in older JRPGs pretty frequently, when the big bad guy that you've been chasing down is more or less a byproduct of this calamity rather than the source. Sometimes it can be well executed, other times not so much, and I feel like Death's Door lacks the runtime or the additional writing to really make the landing. It should also be noted that from the moment that you meet the Old Crow for the last time to the final blow against the final boss, it's all done and over with within 30 minutes, which to me is like, okay, now you're just trying to brute force your way to the ending by any means necessary. The core takeaway that I want to impart is that I just want developers to give me a reason to feel some sort of emotion for these characters, rather than just tell me that I should. I mean, look at Death's Door's source material, for example. Why do we care about pursuing Ganondorf in Ocarina of Time? Why are we motivated to hunt down Ganondorf in Twilight Princess when he's only really presented as the threat during the last 10 to 15% of the game? Why do we care so much about the well-being of Solaire of Astoria, or why does the mission of Sigward of Katarina make such an impact on the player? It's because the developers and story writers gave us a reason to. These are characters that inspire us by their indomitable spirits, or anger us by their ruthless tactics, both directly and indirectly, or makes us adore them for their dorky and charming demeanor. That's what makes these games great. It's not just the journey, but the friends and enemies that we make along the way. Or look at the inverse example. Perhaps fewer details would have been a better idea. A great game within this genre that has little to no story related to the player is Minute. I thought I was just doing chores the whole time until I reached the final area, and I call that game a modern classic. I am personally convinced that someone at Acid Nerve had to make the executive decision to accelerate the final act by steamrolling everything. To have such a strong beginning and middle sequence only to be that inconsistent towards the end feels like the team was forced to cut some fat. Whether it was time restraints or budget restrictions, I'll never know. I just feel like Acid Rain put a lot of quality work in the first half only to cut it short when it really mattered. Death's Door is otherwise an outstanding game that really nails down the compact adventure RPG design, so don't walk away feeling like I'm just calling this game an overhyped mess. There's a reason why I stuck it out to the end, and then some, just to go through that bullshit collectathon nonsense in the post-game. Like seriously, go play Death's Door, it's legitimately great. This is just my experience with it, and if this game spoke to you on a spiritual level or just scratches that itch in the right place, you are more than welcome to say, hey man, this ain't it. We can talk it out in the comments, though I'll probably end up resigning to some bullshit like agree to disagree. If you like this video, or at the very least respect me for having some sort of opinion on the topic, please drop a like, support the channel, subscribe for more lukewarm takes and retrospectives, and if you really like me, give me money on Patreon. I take those too. I'll shout you out at the end of the video like I'm doing for Okami Council, who's been holding it down for a year. I appreciate you, brother. Anyway, if school isn't completely demolishing me, I should be out with a new video soon. If not, it comes out when it comes out. Anyway, thanks for watching, and all of you take care.